75 years. It's been 75 years. And next April, we will celebrate Israel's 75th birthday. I'm sure our local celebrations will feature falafel, Israeli salad, hummus, and Israeli music. And while we might pause to acknowledge that Palestinians called this day their catastrophe, their Nakba, for them this is a day of mourning, we usually reserve one day of the year on Yom HaAtzmaut in the Jewish community as a day free of criticism of who Israel was, who Israel is, or who Israel could be. We celebrate the fact that Israel simply exists. The realization of a 2,000-year-old dream. Yet many Jews, young and old, they won't participate in Yom HaAtzmaut celebrations. They won't criticize, they won't celebrate. Their lack of participation doesn't stem from animosity, but rather apathy. 75 years after the birth of the Jewish state, 78 years after the end of the Holocaust, the connection to Israel for many Jews has faded. Likely they will ask, and we ask ourselves on this Rosh Hashanah, why Israel? Why should we care about Israel? We first ask, does the Reform movement care about Israel? While many Jews, young and old, are beginning to feel more disconnected, the major denominations of Judaism, including the Reform movement, continue to express support. In 2009, the president of the Union for Reform Judaism, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, stated that throughout the Reform movement's history, in times of peace and in times of strife, we have spoken out in unequivocal and unconditional support of the state of Israel and her people. When Rabbi Jacobs spoke of the history of the Reform movement, however, he meant the history of the Reform movement since the state of Israel was founded in 1948. 50 years prior to that, in 1897, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, known as the CCAR, the rabbinic leaders of the Reform movement, issued a different unequivocal statement. In 1897, they said, "We totally disapprove of any attempt for the establishment of a Jewish state." Entrenched in modernity, they were living 1900 years since the destruction of the temple in Reform Judaism. These early Reform Jews considered a new Jewish state to be an anathema. Over the next 4 decades, as anti-Semitism flared in Nazi Germany, especially as America turned away Jewish refugees, as Ken Burns reminded America last week, attitudes changed quickly and drastically. With the need for a safe haven for Jews again crystal clear, in 1937, the CCAR completely reversed course. They declared, in the rehabilitation of Palestine, a land hallowed by memories and hopes, we behold the promise of renewed life for many of our brethren. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make it not only a haven of refuge for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life. This dramatic shift in attitude from our Reform ancestors in just 40 years, spanning one generation, can inform how we examine our own relationship to the Jewish state on the eve of Israel's 75th birthday. Israel has now been a state for 2, 3, even perhaps 4 generations. And today, attitudes are again shifting quickly. While our movement leaders continue to offer unequivocal support, a growing majority of American Jews are asking themselves, why Israel? The why for Israel especially is complicated. Why do we have a Jewish state? Why do we tolerate the occupation? Why does the American Jewish community continue to donate hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel every year? Why do we lobby the US government to send military aid? Why do we continue to talk about Israel here in the synagogue? Why does Israel impact me as an American Jew? Why do we as American Reform Jews, the largest denomination in the US, align ourselves with a country that barely recognizes us as legitimate? And why did God promise Israel, of all places, to our ancestors? The list of whys continues. For years, I have argued that Jews, no matter where we live or how connected we are existentially connected with our homeland. And therefore, we have no choice but to engage with Israel. I argued this even while I was living in Israel 15 years ago as a rabbinical student. I was bombarded with people telling me, even the cab drivers driving me to synagogue on Shabbat, that Reform Judaism is illegitimate, or that my plans to return to America were going to harm the Jewish people, all of them. I continue to argue our existential connection even as the occupation persists, as Israel continues to expand settlements, defend those who terrorize Palestinians with violence, and push against efforts to recognize non-Orthodox Jewry. That Israel is pretty, is home to important Jewish historical sites, has chosen Hebrew as the language, has a thriving tech sector, all of those are nice, but they don't atone for the modern day sins. As more Jews struggle with these transgressions, we find ourselves powerless to make change. Support for Israel is beginning to wane. In 2021, the last Pew study reported that only 48% of all Jews between 18 and 29 in the US felt very or somewhat attached to Israel. That's a major shift from 7 years later when a same study found that 61% of that demographic felt very or somewhat connected. 48% is fewer than half of all Jews in that demographic. The attachment levels for older Jews, those 50 and older, declined as well, from 72 to 64%, again in only 7 years. As a child, I was taught that Israel was a perfect place, only to learn about her imperfections in a way that felt as though a rug had been yanked out from under me and I was in free fall. My story is not unique. Many of those who share this narrative didn't become rabbis, they simply disengaged. Yet I still believe that American Jews, or any Jews for that matter, must engage with Israel. We have no control over Israel's politics, but Israel continues to affect us here in the United States, whether we want to or not, and often unfairly. Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and the occupation fanned the flames of an ancient anti-Semitism. That deserves an entire sermon of its own, and it will receive that on Kol Nidre. But that anti-Semitism includes not only white nationalists who we assume don't like us, but our allies, when they cross from anti-Zionist rhetoric to anti-Semitism with ease. When it relates to Israel, however, our mainstream Jewish organizations use accusations of anti-Semitism to avoid wrestling with Israel's policies. Writing in the New York Times this summer, Peter Beinart argues that these organizations, such as the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League, have pivoted from defending all human rights to primarily defending Israel policy, even when that policy clearly violates human rights. They claim that almost any criticism of Israel equates to anti-Semitism. Beinart notes that these organizations and others immediately invoked anti-Semitism to discredit both a Human Rights Watch and an Amnesty International report which claimed apartheid in Israel. Beinart compares this tactic of isolation to when China claims that anti-Chinese bias is responsible for the negative reports from those very same organizations. Yet we, unlike the Chinese, do not live behind a great firewall of misinformation. We can read the news and the stories ourselves. So instead of embracing the nuance embodied by our Jewish ancestors, When mainstream Jewish organizations use broad strokes of anti-Semitism to silence critics, they drive more Jews away from engaging with Israel, and even with involvement in mainstream Judaism itself. We witness this just here in New Haven. At this very moment, a group of anti-Zionist Jews called the Mending Minyan are observing the High Holy Days at the Palestine Museum. They've even engaged a rabbi from a mainstream Jewish organization, the Reconstruction Judaism movement. Mending Minyan advertises themselves for people who don't feel welcome in traditional congregations that support Israel. They are part of a small but growing national trend. For 2,000 years, Jews have approached every single situation with critical thought and multiple perspectives, and we should approach Israel with that same critical approach. So for the future of the Jewish people, we need to answer the question, why? Why in 2022, with our foundation solidly laid here in the United States, should we as modern Reformed Jews care about Israel? The spoiler alert is that I believe we should. That I love Israel. I proclaim myself a Zionist and strongly condemn the occupation and work toward a two-state solution. Some might and have accused me of hypocrisy, which is okay, because our Jewish ancestors fully embraced hypocrisy. We devised methods to work around the commandments that cause us the most inconvenience, like the Shabbat elevator that is permissible to use so long as we don't press any of the buttons, and therefore must gaze longingly at every single floor as the doors open or close en route to our destination. But that hypocrisy goes back thousands of years to Rabbi Hillel's Pruz Bowl, a legal document from 1800 years ago that allows us to not forgive debts as clearly laid out in the Torah because of economic issues. Jews have been hypocritical for 2,000 years, the same amount of time as we have dreamed to return to Jerusalem. And even when Rabbi Jacobs declared unequivocal and unconditional support of the state of Israel and her people, he continues in that very same statement to express that this support stems from the love of the land and an understanding that the destinies of the Jewish people and of Israel are intertwined in an unbreakable connection. These ties remain enduring even when our love for Israel compels us on occasion to express disagreement with government policies on issues such as the peace process, or on behalf of full rights and support from the government of Israel on behalf of all streams of Judaism. We express unequivocal support and criticism at the very same time, just like a complicated family relationship born of steadfast love. Since declaring this unequivocal support in 2009, the Reform movement has approved several resolutions criticizing the Israeli government for continued settlement expansion in the occupied territories and pressuring the Israeli government to recognize Reform Judaism as a legitimate expression. How can we offer unequivocal support and yet strongly condemn and criticize at the very same time? And why should we continue to invest our monetary, political, and intellectual resources supporting an Israel that continues these transgressions regardless of our rebuke? We begin to answer this question, why, by looking at a 1,500-year-old teaching from our Talmud. It teaches Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bazeh, that all of Israel is responsible for one another. This statement forms the basis of our collective responsibility to help other Jews. And it comes in the form of tzedakah, charity, and also tochacha, rebuke. Leviticus, we cite all the time, love your neighbor as yourself. The verse right before that states, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart, rebuke your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. Tochacha, offer rebuke. Our Torah commands us to help others avoid transgressions ourselves by pointing out the sins of others as we help others make teshuvah, or return to be the best versions of themselves. That responsibility toward one another in good times and in challenging times forms that basis of existential connections to one another. When the state of Israel approves settlement construction in the West Bank, when it continues to deny Reform Jews the same rights and opportunities as the ultra-Orthodox, and when it even passes laws that impede the peace process, we are obligated to speak out and fulfill the mitzvah of tochacha, rebuke. 10 years after articulating unequivocal support, in 2019, Rabbi Rick Jacobs poignantly expressed how he lives with this very tension. "Let me be perfectly clear," he writes. "As a lifelong Zionist, I believe in the justice and rights of the Jewish people. I also believe in the justice and rights of the Palestinian people. That's why I believe in two states. As the leader of the largest Jewish movement in North America, I and so many of my colleagues have been anything but silent in the face of this painful reality for Palestinians living under occupation. One can be deeply committed to Israel's security and well-being and fully supportive of the right of Palestinians to a homeland that is side by side with Israel. Even the current Prime Minister of Israel, Yair Lapid, declared at a UN conference last week, an agreement with Palestinians based on two states for two people is the right thing for Israel's security, for Israel's economy, most importantly, for the future of our children. But before we can articulate our own positions, we must first articulate why. Even if we eventually decide to become anti-Zionist, positing a Jewish state shouldn't exist, or even if we decide to stand with Israel no matter what, or even if we take a nuanced, balanced approach, we still must answer, why Israel? To help us answer this question, this fall we will engage in a series of discussions from a curriculum from the Shalom Hartman Institute, whose mission is to strengthen Jewish peoplehood, identity, and pluralism. Now, President David Silverstone has attended many of their seminars here in the US and abroad in Israel, and I'm always uplifted when I hear of your transformational experiences. Beginning Sunday, October 30th at 10 a.m., we will consider what it means to be a member of the Jewish people. We'll explore the core values that animate Jewish peoplehood and the contemporary challenges to Jewish unity. We'll examine forces dividing the Jewish people today, including nationalism, anti-Semitism, dual loyalty, and identity politics, and we'll imagine a new framework that can help us grow the story of our people for a new millennium. You can find some information in your handout. You can call the CMI office or look online to register for that class. State of Israel, the politics, the innovation, the conflicts, both the good and bad, affect Jews around the world. They affect us here this morning in New Haven and Hamden, Connecticut. For centuries, millennia, we have asked ourselves why and struggled through those answers. And yet we always return to Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bazeh. All of us are responsible for one another. The fate of all of us lies in each of our actions and our hands. May we begin the year 5783 with intentionality and love for one another. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.